Thank you for joining me this afternoon. We'll be taking a closer look at Psalm 3 today. As David's son Absalom rose to power, he decided that he was going to take the kingdom away from David. He united the different sections of the land, and he had them simultaneously rise up against David. When David heard of this, he evacuated the palace, and overnight he crossed the river and climbed the Mount of Olives barefoot and weeping. This hopeless, desperate situation is the situation in which David wrote Psalm 3. O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the one who lifts my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessings be upon your people. Today we will be exploring what it means to have deliverance in God. David understands that even in the face of his enemies, he can rely on God, who has proven himself to be faithful. In any situation, we can rely on God. You and I must reevaluate our circumstances in light of God's presence in our lives. In my experience, in my own personal struggles, as well as those of the people I've talked to, the phrase in verse 2, there is no deliverance for him in God, is still heard very often. The difference, however, is where we are hearing these words from. The last year and a half, we've spent more time alone apart from our community than we could have imagined. We've waited in fear, watching 674,000 Americans die from COVID, wondering if we or our loved ones would be next. Because of this situation, the percentage of Americans who experience depression or anxiety has gone from 11% in 2019 to 42% in December 2020. Nearly half of our adult population is telling themselves, there is no deliverance for you. This is a struggle that we see David wrestle with in this psalm. Our first step is to recognize. We see David recognizing his circumstances. He knows what to bring to God. So often we feel overwhelmed by our circumstances, but we don't take a minute to figure out what it is that's overwhelming us. He recognizes both the external situation, the enemies that are coming after him, as well as the internal situation, these words that have taken root in him. We must not become so overwhelmed with our everyday lives that we neglect bringing our needs to him. Our next step is to rely. Again, we find that David focuses both externally and internally. He calls God a shield, knowing that he will protect him from the enemies around him. But he also writes that God lifts his head. To lift one's head is a sign of dignity, acceptance, and approval. David calls out to God in verse 4, knowing that he can rely on God to be his deliverer. He relies on God as he sleeps, just as he does in the face of thousands of enemies. Finally, we must reflect. If you've ever applied for a job, then you know that experience is highly sought after. It is valuable to the employer that you have gone through these situations before, but what is experience worth if you don't reflect on it? What good is it if it doesn't inform your future actions? David sees how God has been faithful in his life and concludes that salvation belongs to the Lord. One theologian writes of these verses at the end, where he writes, Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek, you have shattered the teeth of the wicked. He writes that these have a self-serving edge, that they are a cry for vengeance, but I disagree. David actually pleads with the leaders of his army in 2 Samuel 18, verse 5. He says, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. In verse 33, he weeps over the death of his son who sought to kill him. In light of these details, the passage shows David's reflection on how God has worked in his circumstances. God hasn't just put a pause on David's afflictions, he's punched them hard enough to break their teeth. He's come through for David in an overwhelming manner. David has been in this situation before. He has faced enemies time after time, and he understands how to deal with it. He recognizes where he is physically, spiritually, and emotionally. He relies on God to sustain him and shield him. He reflects on God's faithfulness in his life. These steps only work for David because of who God is. He can rely on God because God is reliable. He can reflect on God's power because God is powerful. He can rejoice in God's deliverance because God is a deliverer. In any situation, we can rely on God, who has proven himself to be faithful to his people. If you've experienced God's faithfulness in your life, I challenge you to reflect on that. My dog Mocha is a 7-month-old German Shepherd. She was rescued with her mom and sister in the Everglades. Every morning, as soon as we wake up, she tackles me. She pins me down. She squeezes out every second that she can spend with me. Do you wake up eager to spend time with the one that rescued you? I invite you to remind yourself when you feel that there is not deliverance for you, that you have been delivered, that God is by your side. Your response to these things should be to seek him out and to worship him. Your salvation means that your circumstances no longer have power over you. In addition, reflecting on the way God has worked in your life, there are 2 tips outlined in the article, A Real Dose of Hope When You're Feeling Hopeless, that I would like to share with you. It says, focus on purpose and think in moments. You've got to view your life and your situation in light of God's purpose for you. If God's plan for me right now were to be a musician or a dancer, then I'll tell you I'd be the most hopeless in this room. However, that's not God's plan for me, so those things don't have any power in my life. Don't let the things that God hasn't called you to overwhelm you. Also think in moments. The times in my life where I see anxiety start to surface is where I become curious about my future. What church will I serve in when I graduate? What degree will I pursue when I have the chance? God has called me to be where I am right now, and he will sustain me through wherever he calls me next. If, on the other hand, you haven't experienced the salvation that David writes about, then your steps are the same. First, recognize that you have sinned, that you cannot save yourself. Maybe you've heard it said about you that there is no deliverance for you in God. There's a song called Fear is a Liar where it says, when he told you you could be the one that grace could never change, fear, he is a liar. Don't let fear stop you from hearing the words of Jesus today. John 5:24 says, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from life to death. Life, hope, salvation, deliverance from everything that overwhelms you is waiting no matter who you are or what you've done. Once you've recognized that you are unable to save yourself, you must rely on Jesus, who lived a perfect life and died on the cross in your place. He paid the price for your sin, which is death, so that you can rely on him in salvation. Then reflect on how this decision will change your life. You are a new creation whose identity is found in a perfect and holy God.